Good evening, good morning for everyone, those who are in the room and those who are joining virtually. I'm Eszter Kismődi, Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, and a warm welcome to all of you. SRHM is an organization that promotes sexual and reproductive health and rights globally, and we are so pleased to be here with you today, with representations of many people, trustees, editorial advisory board members, editorial team members, advisors from all around the world, and partners, readers and writers of the SRHM journal. So we are a journal, but we are also more than a journal, creating and participating in spaces that motivate rights-based research, knowledge creation, policy, services, and practice. On this very note, this symposium today aims to create a dialogue space by connecting a local audience here in Delhi, colleagues from India, Nepal, Sri Lanka being present in the room, and with others connecting virtually from all over the world. More than 400 people signed up, and we are hoping that most of you were able to connect by now, thanks to technology and all the technicians who make technology happen. The symposium is part of SRHM's rights-based knowledge creation initiative, and also SRHM South Asia program being created with partners in the region and supported by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation India on this very subject. This symposium is coming from a place that connects thinking, dialogue, and action, which recognizes that in more than ever, probably, and more than any other area of health, ensuring sexual and reproductive health and justice across the world is influenced by ideology-based policies which violate human rights and damage health and well-being. The symposium brings together academics, researchers, human rights lawyers and activists, practitioners from all around the world, from India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and also from Australia, Kenya, Mexico, and beyond. We are here to think and discuss together what ensuring the ecosystem of human rights and social justice and evidence means. How can we ensure that research is conducted, knowledge is developed, and linked to action are human rights based, and why all of this matter? In particular, today we will discuss the content, meaning, and relevance of deconstructing the notion and hierarchy of evidence and evidence creation, pushing methodological boundaries in SRHR research, questioning what constitutes evidence-based, researcher, and what is scientifically appropriate, and questioning power in research and ensuring participation. We have two panel discussions that is connecting panelists present in the room, and welcome to all of you, with discussant joining virtually, and with the audience here and all over the world. I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce the chairs of the two panels, Sundari Ravindran and Sapna Desai. Sundari, I'm very pleased to hand over the chairing of the first panel.
Thank you, Esther. My name is Sundari Ravindran, and I am one of the senior editors of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters Journal. And I'm very happy to be presenting before you this panel, which is going to be really exciting and bringing you diverse perspectives on the what constitutes rights-based knowledge creation and why it is important from different perspectives. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Subhasri Balakrishnan. Subhasri, what I would like to know from you is that as the anchor of the South Asia Mentorship Program, which deliberated on the why, how, what, and who of rights-based knowledge creation, and also produced a guide for the mentees of the mentorship program. What this process of deliberation has led to in terms of, can you share with us some of your thinking that has evolved from this process?
This is not coming.
Over to you, Subhasri.
Yeah, thank you, Sundari. I hope this will keep up with that because there seems to be some lag. So like Sundari said, I'm going to be kind of conveying what our understanding of rights-based knowledge creation has been as we've gained it through the process of the mentorship program. No, this is not moving. Can you help me move? It's not. Okay, there's some lag. Okay, so I want to say that first of all, when we say knowledge creation, we mean it to denote much more than what the knowledge, the production of knowledge through academic research. We also mean it to include a wider set of different sets of knowledge creation. This is not matching with that. Yeah, okay. Which also includes a wider set of knowledge produced, which comes from knowledge gained from implementation of programs, experiential learning, legal and policy analyses, community-led knowledge production, which could include documentation of experiences, documentation of rights violations, community-based initiatives. So when we say knowledge creation, we are looking at something much beyond what comes from the academic research space. So just want to clarify, just want to lay that first. Now, why do we need a human rights-based approach to knowledge creation, especially in the field of SRH? Now, sexual reproductive health, as we all know, is much more than just a biomedical issue. We all know the determinants that kind of influence sexual reproductive health, especially gender itself. We've also seen and documented rights violations in SRH services, and there is a whole range of rights violations that have been documented in literature. There are legal and policy barriers to different areas of sexual reproductive health. Now, bringing a rights lens would then help identify these, the underlying denial or promotion of human rights values and norms for any SRH issue. But more importantly, what it does is it enables all, and especially those from marginalized communities, it enables them with capacities and resources to claim their sexual reproductive health rights, and in a way that actually is empowering for them. And it also simultaneously provides an opportunity to hold duty bearers accountable for, fulfilling the human rights obligations. Now, there are a whole set of rights principles that have been described in literature that are well accepted as underpinning rights-based knowledge creation, and I've listed them here just to kind of quickly look at it. Right to non-discrimination and equality, right to the highest attainable standard of health, including availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality, right to autonomy and self-determination, which includes informed decision-making, right to privacy and confidentiality, and accountability, which also includes transparency, and right to participation itself. So a whole set of human rights that are, well accepted as underpinning rights-based knowledge creation. Now, when we say we take a rights-based approach to knowledge creation, what does it actually mean? It means that the knowledge creation process, the content of the knowledge creation, the knowledge that is created, what knowledge is created, how the whole process of knowledge creation, and who the stakeholders who are involved in the process of knowledge creation, all of them kind of are, influenced by a rights-based approach. And over the next few minutes, we'll be taking you through a few examples, from literature that we looked at and we put together as part of this guide towards understanding what rights-based knowledge creation is, or how people have actually put in a rights lens into the whole knowledge creation process. So first, looking at the content itself, the what of knowledge creation. Now, one way of bringing in a rights lens would be to undertake research that has or implement an initiative that directly is connected to the realization of a particular human right. For example, you study the experiences of particularly vulnerable communities as related to their access to sexual reproductive health. That could be one way. Studying accountability, which Sana had put together a whole set of literature on that in the area of sexual reproductive health. So directly looking at these human rights principles as they are related to sexual reproductive health is one way of doing it. But that's not the only way. And in literature, there are very interesting kind of examples of how people have brought in a human rights lens to what are considered even mainstream, very mainstream biomedical issues. So I'll be looking at two examples here. So one is a study from Mozambique in Africa, which looked at a program where misoprostol, a drug that prevents excessive bleeding after childbirth, PPH, was actually being given into the community. So which was trying to improve access. And I mean, this is a very, very biomedical kind of intervention. But they brought in a whole rights lens into the evaluation of the into the program by bringing in a rights language and framing their research questions by saying, is women's right to access the life-saving medicine misoprostol uniformly fulfilled for all women? So bringing in the whole right to access and also the right to non-discrimination and equality there. Is women's right to information regarding the life-saving medicine fulfilled? Are women able to exercise choice, right to self-determination, to decide where to have their birth? So is misoprostol being given only for those who birth in facilities, or is it also for women who are birthing outside of facilities, at home or in transit? So bringing in a rights lens to this very, very biomedical kind of issue. The second example is a study which looked at cervical cancer screening programs in different countries, and again brought in a rights framing to the question. So is the right to access cervical cancer screening available to all without any discrimination? So what are the factors that affect poor screening rates among different marginalized communities? So again, a very, very mainstream biomedical program like cervical cancer screening, and bringing in a whole rights lens to that. So that is about some examples of how the content itself can be, a rights lens can be lent to it. The way the process of knowledge creation has also been approached is again very interesting, and there are different ways in which this has been looked at in literature. So one, of course, is to ensure the right to participation in the whole process of knowledge creation. I'll be looking at this a little more in detail later. There are also other interesting ways. One is to bring in different ways of knowledge creation as related to the community that you're studying, and bringing in their own beliefs and epistemologies into the whole process of knowledge creation. The third is to use feminist principles, and which are closely allied to the human rights principles, into the whole research methodology process. And the fourth is ways in which even traditional methodologies like epidemiology have been challenged by bringing in alternative approaches like lay epidemiology. So I will just take one example here, which is a study from Canada, which looked at the SRH experiences of indigenous youth. And there are large-scale data shows that their SRH outcomes of this community are much poorer than the other communities in Canada. And here the researchers who were documenting these SRH experiences actually brought in these principles as guidance into their own research collaboration with the communities. So they tried to bring in meaningful community engagement. They tried to bring in the the traditional beliefs and research epistemologies, ways of knowledge creation. So stories, understanding through stories as part of their research process. Then defined the whole indigenous belief of doing good as something that was going to guide their whole research process. So participation was not only through, participating in the research process, in the research itself, but actually setting the kind of, the framework of the research design itself. And so this is one way in which the process of knowledge creation has been imbued with a rights lens. And lastly, the who of knowledge creation. So what does bringing in a rights lens mean when you say who comes into the whole process of knowledge creation? And here there are again lots of examples of how the right to participation, and not just very tokenistically, but rather in a very, very meaningful way to bring in engagement. And there are several, ways in which people have done it through the whole research process. So starting from, selecting the research topic in consultation with the community, all the way up to, developing an analysis plan, inclusion of the philosophies and ways of thinking and belief systems of the community into the whole analysis, taking back the research to the community, and then, discussing the interpretation of the results and finalizing recommendations in consultation with the community. So all through right from the beginning till the stage of, recommendations, engaging with the community that is being researched or that is being, in a meaningful manner. One example that I wanted to give here is the Dead Women Talking initiative, of which I was a part, and several friends in this room have also been a part, where we documented maternal deaths across several states. And one way that we actually tried to bring in participation was to take the analysis of the maternal deaths back to the community itself by presenting it in Gram Sabhas or in women's self-help group meetings, and then discussing it there so that they could come up with ways of action at the community level that could prevent such deaths in the future. So these are ways in which the who of the knowledge creation process has been expanded to include a much wider range of people who are part of that process, rather than the researcher seeing that as the domain of the researcher and the researched alone. So therefore, just to sum it up, what does a rights-based knowledge creation process add in terms of value? So it has a absolutely transformative potential in kind of, framing the content, process, and the outcome of the research. In terms of the content, the knowledge that is created is informed by perspectives of those affected. The process is mindful of non-discrimination and addressing inequalities, of participation, of transparency, of accountability. And the outcome aims to contribute to knowledge creation that presents another reality, alternative explanations, and then informs advocacy, and finally inspires social change, which is why we are all in this whole process of knowledge creation. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Subhasri, for setting the tone for the panel this afternoon. And now let me turn to Prabina Bajracharya. Prabina is a human rights lawyer working in Nepal. Prabina, as a human rights lawyer working on reproductive and sexual health issues in Nepal and in Asia, what is your perspective on the value of rights-based knowledge creation? How does this kind of rights-based knowledge creation help in the kind of work you are doing?
Sure. Thank you, Sundari. So right-based knowledge creation and evidence building is crucial for the work we do. So I'm with the Center for Reproductive Rights. It's a global human rights organization. And we work towards ensuring that sexual and reproductive health and rights are protected in the law as the fundamental human rights, but at the same time also ensuring that these rights are realized or people can enjoy these rights. But as we know, given the numerous legal, procedural, or social barriers, access to full range of sexual and reproductive health services and information is seriously restricted. So in this context, when we work towards making the government accountable to fulfill their human rights obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill SRHR, the right-based knowledge creation and evidence building becomes a very crucial tool for our advocacy. And we conduct fact-finding study as part of it. And our fact-finding work is a qualitative narrative research, and it has really opened up a path for documenting serious human rights violation in SRHR and seeing this as a violation and also this violation being addressed. And in our work in Asia, the way we have used this fact-finding result is in 5 different ways, which I'll share through examples. One is to use this fact-finding data on advocating with the policymakers for abortion law reform in Nepal. Secondly, doing a UN advocacy for decriminalization of abortion, again in Nepal. Then also bringing strategic litigation And then doing again UN advocacy on a SRHR issue on a specific country by the special inquiry from the UN committee. And lastly, but not the least, doing kind of wider legal advocacy work for right-based abortion law. So I'll give examples from Nepal and then Philippines and India in this context, what we have done and how we have used it. So in Nepal, as many of you might know, until 2002, abortion was completely banned and it was criminalized. So it was an offense. And then in that context, we conducted a fact-finding study with our partner on the ground, whereby we documented the voices from the women who were in the prison, who were incarcerated for having abortion, or sometimes even just for miscarriage because of the legal context at that time. And we documented their voices, but at the same time, our attempt was to link those narratives or those stories with the human rights framework. So really demonstrating how what they experienced was a violation of right to life to begin with, right to non-discrimination, right to sexual reproductive autonomy, right to privacy, right to information, or so forth, and how the given legal context or legal barrier has been perpetuating it. It was with that, at that time, the data on maternal mortality was important to do the advocacy for law reform. But at the same time, this data was really important to change the mind of the policymaker and ultimately getting the law reform for legalization of the abortion in 2002. And then more recently, we did another fact-finding in 2017, where our attempt was really to document the continued criminalization of abortion, because the law at that time, it legalized, but then it did not decriminalize. So the abortion is still within the penal code. And we use this data again, documenting the voices of women who suffer impact from this decriminalization, and show that evidence to the UN mechanisms, to the CEDAW committee, to the UPR, and get the stronger recommendation for the government of Nepal to decriminalize abortion or removing abortion from penal code. So for advocacy with the policymaker and then UN advocacy. And the third example I wanted to give was another study we did on contraceptive access to rural women and how they don't have enough access to information as well as the services, and documenting their story and putting their story in context of 3AQ that Subhasri mentioned on the right to health and right to SRHR, and how that has been a violation. And with that information, we went to the court as a PIL in the Supreme Court, and the court decided in the favor of the petition. And when the court made the decision, the court did take this as one of the crucial evidence to make this decision. And then again, coming to Philippines, I'm rushing it because of my time. Philippines also, we did two fact-finding study, one on the ban, the impact of the ban on modern contraceptive in the Philippines, as well as the abortion ban. And again, documenting the voices of women and linking that with human rights framework and demonstrating it as a violation. And that has really kind of resulted in first ever CEDAW inquiry on SRHR across, that was the first time CEDAW committee made a special inquiry on situation of SRHR in Philippines, and they made a very strong recommendation on the situation on the ground. So that is another way we use this fact-finding data. And lastly, again, but not the least, we recently also we just published that report last year in August. So we did a fact-finding study in India based on 4 states, study in 4 states, and we did that study with universities here in Delhi and in Bangalore. And that was really to document legal barriers to abortion in India, and the documenting the voices and stories of the women, but also at the same time, the providers, the RMPs and all, and showing even in the context of this revised MTP Act, how still this act is not right-based and how this can be right-based, So this study also will be an important tool for our continued advocacy in India. So to sum up and to conclude, I'd just like to share and reiterate how we have used this study, and just to sum up with 2 major points. One is, as an international organization, when we do this kind of study and do this research, it's really important to have the national partners' involvement to get the authenticity as well as the credibility of this study, as well as the national ownership. So we always made sure that we partner with the national organization in doing these studies. Secondly, which I wasn't able to elaborate more because of the time, also as an advocacy organization, although our niche is on the legal advocacy, we also see the importance of, and this is the discussion we have been having last 2 days, importance of the intersectionality of the knowledge creation and evidence building, and use of different lenses in the research and advocacy work, even we do. So I think with that, I would like to stop here. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that fascinating description with illustrative examples of how rights-based knowledge that has been created can concretely lead to change on the ground. Fantastic. Now let me turn to Priya Nanda. Dr. Priya Nanda is a researcher and now works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, India, and has been one of the, a visionary donor in terms of supporting initiatives for rights-based knowledge creation. So what I'd like to ask you is, what do you think are the pitfalls of SRHR research that does not take a rights-based lens? And what is the kind of research that you would like to see more of so that it really makes a difference on the ground?
So thanks, Sundari. Thanks for inviting me on this panel. I think it's like speed dating. I'm now so conscious of the time because I saw how you rushed through everything. So I will try and be concise, but I do want to make some points building from where you've just left. See, what you talked about, Prabina, is like how much the burden of evidence rests on advocacy organizations. And why is that? Is it because as researchers, we are failing to provide the evidence that is needed for precisely the kind of advocacy you're doing? So I'm really picking up from here. And to answer your question, Sundari, what I feel is we have the best of researchers, but because somehow the training and the interdisciplinarity might be missing in training, you're very good methodologists. Often what you find is research on SRHR is not, especially the research that we are looking at as donors to improve programs and policies, is not grounded. It's not really built, it's actually built on very simplistic and deterministic theories and not grounded in the context and the multiple contexts of people's lives and particularly women's lives, because that's really often the work that the foundation really looks at. So void of grounded theories, what you actually find is both the research that is creating the evidence and therefore the programs that are building off that research are actually missing very important aspects. And we can call them opportunities lost, we can call them near misses, or we can call them erroneous conclusions. And it can be very, very risky because actually what you're not understanding of, in reality, everybody understands it. But when we start building our research methodologies, we become highly deterministic and singular. What we don't understand is that people live very complex lives that have many overlapping tropes of power, whether it's social, cultural, political, and all of these power circles or influences are actually creating multiple disadvantages. So it's not a singular disadvantage often that we are talking about. One person who has one disadvantage that we might be trying to address, let's say maternal anemia and a highly anemic pregnant woman, actually her life is not about maternal anemia. It is about many other things. It's about low decision-making, intra-household inequities, inability to have access to work, informality of her work, not having an income, maybe living in a violent relationship. So there are many, many disadvantages. And of course, I'm stating the obvious. But by stating the obvious, what I'm suggesting is that as researchers, we sometimes have to just kind of really put it all out of the lens of being very incisive and singular in our problem and our understanding of the problem. And certain methodologies tend to do that more. So if I was a policymaker, I would say to Prabina, where is this data reliable? Is it valid? Because I don't have 10,000 women's narrative. But the survey can get us the data, but what it doesn't get us is the narratives that you have discussed. So I think I just want to basically, in the first half of the question, say that our theories that ground our research, unfortunately, are very, very simplistic, and they really ignore the intersectionality and the plurality that all of us know from a rights-based approach. So to me, a rights-based lens in research would be starting at least from there. And then perhaps making assumptions that I am choosing to ignore this, but making sure that you know the risk when you choose to ignore a particular aspect of something that you feel cannot be captured in research, then you need to triangulate. You should understand the research, and you need to think about multiple methodologies. So I think that's one of the traps that often I find that research on SRHR. And the specific example that I'd like to give, how much time? Okay, the specific example I'd like to give is like a woman's contraceptive journey, right? So I have colleagues here who are looking at surveys with us on contraceptive journeys. Now, a parallel grant that we've given to UC San Diego is to really help us ground gender measures to understand decision-making, agency, autonomy, because the measures that we have over the last 3 generations are actually not giving us the signal. They're not incisive to really understand the disrupted and fragmented lives of women in which contraception exists, which includes not having control over, when to have sex, how to say no to having sex, whether you're having sex or not, whether you're actually abandoned, but you're a married woman and you're supposed to have sex, the violence that you're facing, whether you actually are having coercive sex, whether you are actually having consent or not, or whether you are actually seeking contraceptives without disclosing that you're seeking contraceptives. So all of these scenarios, they don't exist in the survey tool. There isn't a survey tool that is going to tell me that this woman is afraid to disclose that she's having contraception. She cannot disclose she's having contraception because actually her husband is a migrant worker. She's not even supposed to be having sex for 9 months that he's a migrant worker. So none of this is the narrative. When I design a survey and I know that I'm working in a context where there's high migration, I have to design my research with that understanding and reality. And then multiple ways in which the woman's life is affected by power that others have over her is really the starting point for the research. So the last part of your question was, what would be rights-based research?
No, what kind of research would you like to? What kind of research would you like to see more of? Okay, and support, right?
I would say that, like, increasingly, definitely we have recently supported more embedded research, ethnographies, but not exclusively that. So I think it has to be multiple research where there is survey research blended with kind of very ethnographic methodologies. It has to be multiple methodologies. And I think we have to also build team science in our research. So it's not even what kind of research, it is who are the people who are doing the research. So blend team scientists, which means you bring very, very interdisciplinary teams together, force them to work together. Sometimes they'll fight with each other, but really to come to a really better understanding. So I think I would say we'd like to support much more interdisciplinarity, more grounded understanding, and building your research methodologies after embedding yourself in certain contexts. And then the research that you create actually has to create a very vibrant learning community. Because it isn't just the research. What are we going to do with this? It's a community of practice that we are going to create with the research. So for us, at least from the team that I represent in BMGF, our strategy as the measurement, learning, and evaluation team has been to create innovations in methodologies and team science, in creating more learning communities as a public good. So that, the methodologies that you are creating is a public good. This is not exclusive to a grant of BMGF. So the idea is that these innovations to really incubate and nest and create further innovations and more ambition in the way we can think and do our research. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Priya. So as I promised, this was an exciting panel which provided very diverse perspectives. And now let me hand over to Esther for very provocative discussions from discussants located in many different parts of the world. Over to you, Esther.
Thank you. And can I just say, coming out of a 2 days South Asia strategy meeting, how much I'm enjoying this hybrid place. I just have to advocate that it requires financial and time and human resource investment, but we were sitting for 2 days in a meeting, and actually people from around the world could join us like they would be in the room. I mean, it's fantastic. It's amazing. It's amazing to be with you here, but it's also amazing to connect. For example, with Sabina at 6 a.m. in Boston. Hello, Sabina. Can we have a full picture on the screen of Sabina? If you pin her, she will come in. Hi, Sabina. Can you hear us?
I can. How are you,
Oh
Esther?
It really feels you are in the room with us. Hello. Good morning. Sabina, just a short introduction. Sabina Faiz Rashid is the Dean of the Public Health School of Brak University in Bangladesh, a professor and researcher specializing in gender, sexual and reproductive health, sexuality, poverty, and the rights of marginalized populations in Bangladesh. Sabina, you are an expert and practitioner who has been engaging with this issue for years and decades. And you also, we just created a podcast, an SRHM podcast with Laura Ferguson, Sundari, yourself, conversing about this very subject. Can you please tell us what your reflections are on this panel discussion based on your work?
Thanks a lot, Esther. It's wonderful to see all of you and see so many familiar faces. I apologize. I'm joining from a cold Boston. You know, some of the thoughts I had listening to everyone. So first of all, thank you so much for everyone on that expert panel. As you hear about power, politics, privilege, gender, muting of voices, making people invisible. And, you know, I see increasingly sitting here in Boston where they're talking about overturning Roe versus Wade, where I didn't think in 2022 we'd be having these conversations in the US, where in Bangladesh, you know, we have menstrual regulation, which is legal, or many other countries, they're opening up spaces for women to have access to basic abortion rights. So as civil space shrinks, I think I am reminded again how important it is for social justice and public health to prevail. And as I look at knowledge creation, and this could be my own personal take on it, other than, I mean, of course, there's the orientation of researchers who are early career about the importance of this human rights principles and dimensions to SRHR issues, but contexts are critical, as Priya pointed out. And in some contexts, there's some more muting or invisibilizing of issues around SRH, be it LGBTQI, be it certain women groups, be it ethnic minorities, be it religious minorities. But I think knowledge creation, at least for me, is ultimately a personal and a political act. And we need to make visible what is invisible. And the only way, I think, irrespective of disciplines, and I agree, we have limitations in all methodologies. I think it's very important to recognize that even as researchers, we have a certain accountability and responsibility when we design our research questions, when we develop our tools. And that is when we need to bring in communities themselves to validate our tools, to discuss with them, if it's feasible, even in these spaces, to have them as co-researchers or peer researchers, because how do you ensure that it's not just a top-down approach and we're working with communities to give feedback on SRHR? And in some cases, I think it's very, very critical that as researchers, we have a basic ethics or ethos or principles when we're working in this field on what does it mean to apply certain kinds of conceptual framing. But ultimately, I think, as I go back to the main point, is personal, is political. And I do think we need to bring in that element, because increasingly we're living in a world where it's charged with so much discrimination, hatred, biases, and muting of voices. Thank you very much, Esther. I don't want to go on and on, but a real pleasure to be here, and difficult times ahead, I think, around these issues in many parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabina, and we really appreciate that you joined us in such an early morning. Thank you so much. So I'm turning to Avni. Avni, are you here? Can you come up on the screen if it's possible?
I am here. Esther, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Good
Okay,
afternoon.
great. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here and to see friends.
Actually, you see friends in the audience.
Not in the audience, but certainly on the podium.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Avni, for joining us from Geneva, Switzerland. Avni, you work at the WHO Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research on violence against women. Can you please tell us a couple of words about how violence against women research has been enhanced with rights perspective over the past decade or decades, and what difference it makes? And can we just be specific about the influential work of WHO in guideline development, but also how it enables influence and impact?
Sure, thanks. Sure. Really fascinating discussions before this. And one of the things that I was struck by is how do we actually operationalize the principles of rights into the way we conduct research and the way we operationalize the delivery of our guidelines. And we have really, really struggled over the years, experimented, learned, and refined our methodologies. So one example, as most of you will know, is the WHO multi-country study on violence against women. And this is, we embedded the rights-based principles in very, very practical ways through the creation of the ethical and safety guidelines for researching violence against women. This was way back in 2001. And since then, these have become now the gold standard for conducting research on violence against women. One of the principles of human rights that is articulated in the guidelines is the principle of do no harm and women's safety. And practically, when you're collecting data on the ground, you're training researchers and data collectors, what does this mean? So we really had to train researchers, not just in terms of, okay, privacy and confidentiality are important principles, but what does it mean? So the interviewers are trained not to interview more than one woman per household for her safety. If, for example, somebody walks into the room while the interview is being conducted, the interviewers are trained to switch to dummy questions so that the safety is protected. And the title of the study, for example, is never announced to the community as a study on violence against women, so that when women are interviewed, they're not further stigmatized or their privacy and confidentiality compromised. So this is one very concrete example of operationalizing rights. Then it's the standard setting work through the WHO guidelines that you asked me to comment on. And we obviously brought in the evidence synthesis into the development of the guidelines. But once again, the core principles of human rights and gender equality have been core. And how did we operationalize this? Two rights principles that I will talk to. One is the right to bodily autonomy and women's autonomy. A lot of the training that we develop as a result of these guidelines focuses, and we kind of have a very simple mantra when we train health providers. The woman's wishes determine the care you give. And then we unpack that by saying that it's not the provider's role to tell the woman what to do, even if they feel that what is in the best interests of the women. We know that a lot of women don't want to leave their partners. So, giving advice about leave your partners is not the best advice to give. But we instead emphasize that their role is to provide information, give empathy, give support, and offer options so that women can actually make those choices and decisions. Another standard I can talk to is around non-discrimination. And here we've operationalized it through the concept of power, which actually several panelists have talked about. And one of the trainings we do is around, unpacking one's own prejudices and biases through exercises such as blanketed by blame, vote with your feet, in her shoes, which really generate a critical reflection about how one's own power as providers, be it based on caste, class, many other things, and privileges, can impact their communication, the way they talk to women, and therefore women's ability to not only access healthcare, but also their journey towards healing and recovery. And then the third point you talked about was the impact it's created. We know, for example, that disclosure of violence is extremely hard for women, and violence is one of the most underreported issues. So one of the things has been that the ethical and safety guidelines have not only been crucial to having robust, high quality data, but also for many women, it has in some ways, when the research was conducted, become therapeutic, because it's one of the first times that women are disclosing violence, first times they're recognizing that this is not normal or acceptable. And in many ways, for some of them, it has been influential in putting them on a path to recovery and healing. Similarly, the standards we have done with the guidelines have been implemented in 2021 in 71 countries. And they have been really influential in changing the culture of service delivery to one of empathy, kindness, compassion as a counter to the unequal ways in which power has manifested in women's life. So in Afghanistan, this is before the Taliban took over, we trained 7,000 providers in Survivor Center GBV response. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan in Pakistan, similarly, thousands of health providers have been trained. And in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, now they have adopted the curriculum and the standards into pre-service training for doctors, which is huge. And in India, similarly in Maharashtra, in 3 hospitals in Aurangabad and Miraj, with Sehat leading this work, we've trained 200 plus healthcare providers. But we've also recognized that rights principles have to be embedded also in the health systems. And we've tried to very practically operationalize through the health systems pillars, be it through how to document it in facility registers, how to create a health infrastructure that respects the right to privacy, and then really creating champions who can advocate with the junior doctors for a rights-based service delivery culture. Over and out, Esther.
Thank you very, very much. And can I just tell the virtual panelists that how amazingly principled you are with the 5 minutes. So it's amazing how much message a person can convene in 5 minutes. Thank you very, very much. So I'm just checking in with Sara Hossain from Bangladesh. Are you here? Maybe Sara will come in. So I'm turning to Allan. Allan, hello. Oh,
hello.
Fantastic. Hi, Allan. Allan is joining us from Kenya. Thank you very much, Allan, for coming in. It's really such an amazing pleasure to have you here. Allan Maleche is joining us from Kenya. He is the Executive Director of Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS, KELIN. Allan, can you please share your reflection on how rights-based knowledge contributes to legal development and litigation as well, strategic litigation that you are doing with your colleagues and partners, and how it matters for health planning, programming, and service delivery based on the work you are doing, and what kind of evidence, knowledge you need, and how rights is connected to all of this. Over to you, Allan.
Thank you so much, Esther, and I want to use my first few seconds to thank the previous speakers, especially the intervention that were given around rights-based approaches and research and how important they are, and to the fellow panelists who have intervened. And I think I'll start from the point that as a legal practitioner, a rights-based approach is extremely critical in terms of determining who is held accountable for what. And accountability is not only on the part of the state, it is also on the part of private actors, as we've discovered in some of the cases we have been litigating for the last 8 years, challenging the issue of forced and coerced sterilization of women living with HIV. The human rights principles of fulfillment, protection, then become relevant in terms of holding different players accountable. Now, in terms of lawmaking, I think the experience I can cite and a reference I could definitely want everyone in this conference to consider is to have the East African HIV Management Act. This is a law that was developed about 10 or 8 years ago, and a law that was developed using a rights-based approach, consulting with the affected communities, consulting the relevant duty bearers, consulting the relevant UN agencies, and coming up with a regional law that is binding to the 5 East African countries around how to deal with issues of HIV. But in dealing with the issues of HIV, the drafters of the law try to look at it holistically, and they have got very important provisions around sexual reproductive health and rights, particularly for women, and not only women living with HIV, but the way the drafting has been done is broad enough to cover adolescents, young girls, and try to ensure reproductive health knowledge, access to reproductive services and products is available. And so I think looking at it from a legal perspective, having a law that is developed from a rights-based approach, drafted by people who understand human rights principles, the rights-based approach, and having parliamentarians who you've sensitized to pass this law gives you a good legal framework that you can use to hold government accountable, that you can use to be able to take advocacy forward. So that's one law I would definitely say, based on my experience, has been extremely useful in terms of driving the conversation forward. And then in terms of service delivery, I'd want to also speak of a project we're currently taking forward on digital rights for advocacy, where we are working with a number of institutions around how do we get to collect and work with young people to understand the use of digital technologies in rolling out SRHR services, and what principles would they like duty bearers, UN agencies to take into account. So we're doing a research with them, working with them, some of the researchers and data collectors, developing the reports with them, with the hope that we'll develop principles that reflect the views of young people in Vietnam, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Bangladesh, and in Colombia, that can drive a conversation with various agencies, including the WHO, Global Fund, around what principles should be taken into account. And again, from that point of view, involving the affected communities, working with them, empowering them to be able to do the research is something we are learning to be extremely important, that gives credibility and validation. I know I'm pressed for time, but I want to conclude with the issue of service delivery. Applying human rights principles in service delivery for health is extremely critical. And what we've learned from our experience at CareLin has been the importance to train duty bearers, judges, prison wardens, nurses, doctors, pharmacists around. Why is it important to use a rights-based approach in the way you deliver your service? Because then when you do it from a holistic approach. You're not only concerned about the woman who's seeking contraceptives, but you're cognizant enough to find out, is she facing any form of violence? Are there nutritional needs that she's missing? And you're looking at things from a holistic perspective. So again, training those who deliver services on how a rights-based approach works is extremely important. And all this creates an important platform to hold people accountable. If the judge knows what to look out for in the case, having gone through a rights-based approach training, if a healthcare worker is delivering their services, having gone through a rights-based approach training, if the research that has been done with affected communities that allows to inform principles, laws, and policies that are developed from a rights-based perspective, then you've got a better operating environment as a human rights practitioner, as a lawyer, as an activist. And so I think this is the direction we need to go in terms of promoting the rights-based approach, human rights principles being at the center for the delivery of services in sexual reproductive health and rights. So I'd like to end there, but also to take cognizance that we are retrogressing, and it's not a guarantee that these rights will be there for us. We have to claim them, and what has happened in the US is an example that sometimes you can have it and it can just go like that. So we really need to be vigilant and keep pushing for a rights-based approach and human rights principles. Thank you for having me. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Allan. We really, really appreciate. And I think what your last sentence is reminding us, and also what Avni brought in terms of the Afghan situation, that once we win, we cannot take it for granted. It can be taken away. So we almost cannot sleep. We need to be awake all the time, all the time. So I'm handing back for discussion to Sundari. Just one check-in with Sara. Sara, are you here? We cannot see you. Can you please let us know if you are here? So I'm handing back to you, Sundari, for a discussion with the audience and also with the virtual participants through the chat.
Thank you, Esther. And you've heard a lot, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions So I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions from the floor. And you can tell us if it's directed to a particular person or in general. And then Rupsa will look at questions that online viewers have posted in the chat. She will curate those questions and pose it back. So, yes, Aruna? No, wait for the mic.
Okay, it is not a question. In fact, when we were hearing about a lot of rights and these things, from a practical perspective, I always think that rights comes with responsibilities. And in two cases which I have seen in my life, which really has shattered my beliefs or something, one young girl of 18 had abortion. Of course, abortion is legalized in Nepal. But what happened that even after abortion, she didn't have menstruation. And one day in 10th grade, she just fell down. She was unconscious. Thanks God, she was brought to hospital in time. And it was found out that she had ectopic pregnancy, which means that pregnancy out of uterus. And if she was not brought in time, she would have passed away after 1 hour. So the question is that, of course, she had right to have abortion. She had a right to have sexual relation. But then, because it didn't come with her responsibility or knowledge, maybe it was our fault that we were not able to give her information, knowledge that it was not time for her sexual relation, she could have lost her life. And that really made me think, where we failed our young generation, that yes, abortion is your right, reproductive health is your right, and you can use emergency pill, this and that, but without giving her proper information about that, this could also happen and you could lose your life.
Okay,
and,
Aruna?
Yes, so this is my only point is that when we talk about rights, it always should come with responsibility, and it is our duty to inform new generation, young generation, what should they do and how to do.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Yes, and then there's one more hand at the back. Yeah.
I just want to expand where Priya talked about.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Madhumita and I do freelance consulting. I just wanted to go one step forward, Priya, from where you said you need to really bring in interdisciplinary people, researcher to come in and build on more evidence and research. I would say that rights-based research also needs to look at language justice. We always talk about English, and English is everything and the end of it. And when we talk about knowledge production, knowledge creation, for whom we are producing this. So I think that's one of the important piece that we are trying to put across while we talk about decolonizing research and evidence building. Thank you.
Thank you. And one third question from
Hi, my name is Abhiti. Sorry, I joined in little late, so I could not hear everybody. I actually echo what Madhumita was mentioning about language and who are we producing that research work for? So whatever we are writing, whatever we are reviewing, is it understandable enough for the people that we are doing research work for? Or, I mean, I'll be very upfront about this thing, or like, are we using, the rights-based framework in a tokenistic manner where we are using them as subjects to kind of understand, to understand the scenario across. So yeah, just to get a sense of like what could be ways to move beyond these existing structures and how to break them down. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll take one last question, Jasmine, and then hand it over to the panelists.
Yeah, because you said this, you said we need to have scientists, we have to force people from different disciplines to come together. And just taking the example of contraception, or I'll give you an example, like we worked on one-stop crisis centers, we were auditing them, when Nirbhaya Fund came and all. And one of the things we were realizing is when the centers are awesome, it's just that nobody seems to be going there. And we were thinking of, working with designers. So designers came in saying that, we should have brought in designers, we should have brought in safety people, but it's very difficult to get people from different disciplines to come together. So I even think even before proposing, before the writing proposal stage, if there is some kind of funding for researchers from across disciplines to come together and undergo workshops, because our trainings are, I'm a lawyer by training, our trainings are different. Our understanding of issues are different. And for us to even build consensus, it requires some kind of a space. So if the space itself is being made so that then we can think of building proposals, because there are enough government schemes, which is really great. It's just that it doesn't seem to be showing the results we wanted.
Now, I think the first question was about rights and responsibilities. Which of the panelists wants to take that? Two questions were specifically addressed to Priya. And then there were comments on, language justice and so on. So about also, who are we producing research for, which probably you may want to take because it was part of your presentation. So who wants to go on the rights and responsibilities?
Can I take a crack at that rights and responsibility one?
Sure.
So Aruna, I feel the fact that you're juxtapositioning responsibility with rights is for me in this moment problematic. I otherwise would not disagree with you that young people have the right to understand fully and then be making choices with information. I definitely would fully endorse. But the fact that we would call it a responsibility almost negates to me the absolute focus on rights in this instance. So I think I use the idea of language here. We also will have to be mindful because we are trying to really secure spaces for ourselves that are increasingly diminishing. So we have to be mindful and creative around how we will use language to serve the purposes that we think are important, because it's serving a purpose for a much larger community outside of just us. So I take your point, but my submission would be that we don't talk about it in terms of responsibility, because so much of that experience that you described about the adolescent is around social norms, power. Why is that an individual responsibility, right? Like it is the responsibility of the system to be more enabling also for the individual. So I think that one I would hold off on, but I agree. We should enable that nobody reaches the point where they don't have information and they're not making decisions that are not based on correct information. And on the language issue, you know, Madhumita, actually all surveys and research is translated, right, into vernacular language. I think the point is, building off what you also said, is that how much are we then taking back to the community in the language that they understand, which is not even survey language, right? I mean, and I think that honestly, there is very little of research that is produced in conventional research, mainstream research, where we give time to researchers before a project closes. I think there is no researcher here that I know who wouldn't like to logically close the loop. We're like preaching to the choir. Everybody knows that. But our funding cycles, our research programs, our timelines are such that we're not letting that final conclusion happen. And there are many creative ways that that can happen. So with the Population Council Udaya study, there was a small grants that we enabled where community-based organizations through YP Foundation could take that research and create it into different kinds of social media assets to bring back to the community. So it was done, but it was a big push. And way at the end of the research that, you know, we've taken 5 years to collect this beautiful data. Please don't just end with peer review publications. But it really takes push and enablement also from a resource and timeline perspective. So I would say that often, and with any ethnographer will tell you that language is important. If you're not using the language that people use, the terminology that people use, then you're failing your research to begin with. But I think the issue of language and what you're talking about, the politics of language is much bigger, because we are not really enabling people to own the data that we have in a way extracted from them. That's only two things.
Yeah, I would also like to quickly add on to the first question of rights and responsibility, and completely agree with you, Priya. And Arnadi, what I would like to say is, in terms of human rights standard, we should be mindful that the right about SRHR also include right to information and the enabling environment that the adolescent girl can have informed choice and make the informed choice decision. And just to add on the standards being developed, if we look at this, the General Comment 22, which I think we all are familiar with, because this is the General Comment on SRHR. The General Comment 22 is very clear that the evidence base, so this is a kind of evidence the committee was talking about, evidence-based comprehensive sexuality education is part of obligation on the states to provide to the adolescents. So, and we know that states are failing on that, and because states are failing on that, we cannot kind of shift the burden of obligation to an individual adolescent girl. So I think that's where I would stop.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sundari. And I just want to add on to both what Priya and Prabina said on the first question on responsibilities, is that, I mean, there is a discourse actually being built even today in India about, how rights are almost conditional to, fulfilling of your responsibilities. And I think that's a dangerous slippery slope to go down. And I think therefore we need to just to kind of add on to that and say that we need to be very clear that there are rights and then there are duty bearers who are from the state, and who then have the duties and the responsibilities, but the rights are not conditional to actually being good citizens as defined by the state. So just again, kind of echoing what both of you said. The other thing on, who are we producing research for? And I think the whole idea of, rights-based kind of, way of creating knowledge or research is to actually have a much more meaningful engagement with, the community that is quote unquote being studied or researched. I had said in my presentation, there are several examples in literature where actually people have explored how to actually do that, meaningful engagement, which are very, very revealing. And also to, not just to, and Sundari will bear with me, in Northern Tamil Nadu in RUSEC, whenever we've done community-based research, we've really been enriched by taking the findings to the community and asking them to, and they bring in their very, very unique lens on, why something is what it is, and that has actually enriched the research, that even from our own personal experience. So the point I want to make here is who is the research for? And I'm again adding on to what Priya said, but I also think that enriches the research process and the research outcomes and outputs much, much much, makes it really rich to bring in those perspectives and interpretations from the community itself. And on language, I think it's not just language, it's also about formats in which you take the research back to the community that was engaged in the research. And in fact, several of you in this room have been part of the deliberations over the last 1.5 days, and there's been a lot of thought on what could be the formats of knowledge outputs that would actually make this reach a much larger, diverse audience. And I think I completely agree with what you're saying, Madhumita, in terms of language justice, but not just language in the textual form, but also in much wider formats. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I know there are more questions from the floor, but in the interest of justice to the online participants, let me ask Rupsa to read out some of the questions.
Yeah. And I just want to let the virtual participants know that I have noted your names, but I've also just tried to see sort of some of the questions and put them together just so we have enough time to maybe address. I think one important thread of questions and comments that I'm seeing is really around this piece around accountability and the multiple ways. So for example, Amit Rajit had a question about how about including community members in design of methods and in running the research themselves. So accountability to the community. Then there was a question, and that's a very important question, and I think panelists can address it, is how do you hold duty bearers / governments accountable, funders accountable, where often the very use of the word rights and rights-based approach is seen as challenging, as seen as something detrimental, and therefore in that context, this particular conversation and advancing a rights-based approach or integrating it, what are those challenges? Then there was a question around often those who know these methods are doing this kind of research which well integrates rights-based approaches are often on the fringes of research and academia. And the larger sort of body of research and academia is kind of, that drives it is, and so how do you cross-fertilize, how do you build that capacity, how you integrate? So I see a lot of kind of questions, this is for all the panelists, around sort of these different ways one needs to begin to think about accountability being this other side of the coin of doing rights-based work in general and rights-based research in particular. So it would be really helpful if you could take sort of this thread of thinking and comments. And I thought Avni's presentation, and it generated a conversation on this thread around how sometimes the language of rights is not necessarily the most useful way to ensure accountability. And she talked about empathy and compassion and how that could in some ways create a more conducive sort of environment to doing this rights-based work, but how can we use a different framing? So just putting it out there, some of it is questions, some of it comments, but it would be wonderful to hear each of your reflections around this sort of line of thinking.
I think we are also open to people, virtual discussants responding.
Yes.
Also. So Avni's hand is up. Sorry. So Avni, over to you.
Yeah, I didn't see that.
No, it was just in response to some of the discussions happening. And what I'm saying is something that we don't talk about in the rights-based language, right? We use a lot of language around these are the rules, these are the laws, these are your obligations, these are your duties, these are the legal requirements. And our experience, particularly in cultural contexts like Afghanistan and Pakistan, but more broadly, the language of kindness, compassion as a counter to unequal power has resonated a lot more with health providers to actually bring empathy, to bring what I would say, quote unquote, behavior change in how you really work with clients and with patients and with women. Because for health providers themselves, many of them are also in that hierarchy of unequal power in the health systems. The nurses, the midwives, the junior doctors, be it based on caste or whatever. And the language of rights can be quite threatening and off-putting to them. So we try to really work with the training and questioning people's own values, own particular upbringing, and how that can be converted into a more empathetic, compassionate care culture. And I find that maybe in some settings, if you really want to change the behaviors, particularly in the service delivery context, whether we ought to think about other ways to frame this concept, because what is the opposite of unequal power and abuse of power, right? It's a much more kind, compassionate, nurturing way in which we talk, or respectful way in which we talk to people and interact with patients. So it's just trying to figure out what the positive would be.
Avni, did you want to say anything about the accountability question? Did you hear that?
I did. And I mean, I was just going, I think there's been a lot of work done on social accountability, particularly with respect to healthcare settings. So I would just, maybe I'm happy to post the links. There are people with far more experience and expertise in this area who have published on different social accountability measures, particularly for healthcare providers and healthcare settings. So not more to say.
Yeah. Rupsa, the response to one of the responses to the online questions around accountability is that if they can be just a little patient, then the next panel is going to be all about accountability in multiple different ways. And if they see their questions not answered there, then this will be taken up. But is there another question? That probably, you know, one or two more questions, and then we can draw this panel to a close.
Several are linked to sort of this accountability question. So I take your point. I think you could close.
Yeah, but Arundhati had a question.
And just to say, Sara is here.
Has Sara joined now? And does she want to speak? Lovely. Let her join.
Could be. I think.
Let her come. Yeah.
Should I? Thank you.
Hi, Sara.
Thank you.
Are you here?
Hi. I'm here, and thank you for being so accommodating. Yeah, really appreciate it. I don't know if I should join now, if I should just wait and listen to the next panel. It might be a bit disjointed to speak now, whatever you prefer.
Sara. Yes. Sara, come in. Can I just introduce you? We would appreciate if you could come in.
Sure, of
okay,
course.
So you join us from Bangladesh. Thank you so much. Sara is a prominent human rights lawyer who works as a barrister at the bar of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and you are also an honorary executive director of Bangladesh Legal Aid and Service Trust. And Sara, your contribution very much fits into the panel that was already discussing and starting to discuss how evidence and rights-based knowledge matters for challenging laws and realizing human rights based on your experience. And you plan to bring in a very important example. So we would love to hear your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Esther. I wanted to speak about how, not as academics, but as practitioners, how we can find research extremely useful and critical in building strategies of response and strategies for change. And I wanted to just draw on an example which builds on a lot of prior work in South Asia, particularly in India, but which and in fact collaboratively across India and Bangladesh, and then subsequently more widely, which has led to some change in Bangladesh in terms of how we address and respond in terms of the implementation of laws on sexual violence. So our work started, this was through BLAST, with looking at some of our case records on supporting survivors of rape. And the research was initially done with by Asmita Basu, formerly of Lawyers Collective. And, you know, without any very clearly determined, in fact, even kind of research premise. It was just to try and understand what the experiences of our clients and these particular survivors were. And through that initial very small scale study, we found that there were several problems that were identified, and one of them was that medical examinations were being done. The two-finger test was being done essentially on very young women, very older women, women who were married, unmarried, women who'd had sexual experience, not had sexual experience, basically completely indiscriminately and arbitrarily. And we documented that. We then did another kind of iterative study looking at how not only our case records, but how and why lawyers felt that these tests were necessary. We did another set of investigations with forensic doctors, again, asking them the same questions. We then built from that to look at to set up dialogues between forensic doctors and lawyers, through which we discovered that nobody actually felt that these tests were remotely justified. And what became much clearer is that the tests were being justified based on completely outmoded texts that everybody was criticizing, but nobody had taken steps to change. And then subsequently, through that as that common understanding developed, we then looked more broadly at how the similar tests were being used in India and also in Pakistan, how they'd been questioned already in India. And then we looked again at the framework within which these tests were being used, which was the understanding of the need for looking at women's character and sexual history in the context of rape cases. So again, looking back and unpacking the legal frameworks that were being applied. And we got more research done looking at the legal framework itself and not at the application. And based on all of that, we were ultimately able to bring forward strategic litigation, challenging the rules on character evidence and also challenging the practice of two-finger tests, which ultimately led to the government of Bangladesh reforming the protocols for conducting medical examinations. I should say that was a process that was already in place and was being done under a WHO supported initiative, and it was already in place. It didn't happen purely because of the initiative we took, but it was catalyzed, I would say, by that initiative. And now we found ourselves in a position where, as we finally challenged the character evidence rules, ultimately the government also came in to say they're now putting forward finally the amendments to the legislation. So I just wanted to share this example with you. I think to kind of explain from a practitioner perspective why that kind of tight focused research, why the collaborative experience between practitioners and healthcare professionals, the process of building a common understanding and then feeding it into, I think, a sort of activist process did feel so transformative. But the part I didn't mention was that I think a lot of the collective understandings that were developed through these dialogues and through the research were amplified through their being shared with women's groups and very mainstream women's organizations, and really some of the leaders of the movement who took up the issue then following this discussion and this groundwork being laid for them. So I just thought it might be a useful example for us to share here about what is the value of building research, and research that from the outset is bringing together practitioners with researchers who will give that rigor and give that understanding and approach to help build a platform for change, and why, again, building in the women's rights movement at the very outset is so critical to the process. I think that's the kind of experience that we need to see how we can build on further, looking at particular thematic issues and building those kinds of cross-cutting approaches as much as we can. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you so very much, Sara, for joining us. Thank you very much.
So I think it doesn't feel like 75 minutes, but like a lot of new information, thought-provoking, and more to come in the next panel. So thank you very much to all the panelists, virtual discussants, and everyone here for your questions and active participation, and more awaits you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So also for the virtual participants and everyone, please don't leave. We are starting the panel in 2-3 minutes. Please take your coffee, tea, and food and bring it back to your seat, those who are in the room. And please take your coffee and tea, those who are in your homes or offices or in other places. We are back in 2 minutes. intervention was very good. Sara's intervention was very good. Very good. But you know, I was more worried that even you have many speakers and you understand in the institution of the
Hello. Hello.
We would like to start. You want to coffee? It's not crazy, it's good. I like it, I do it time to time. Can you please come back and we start? That is Priya Das. Priya is in the panel. I hope we didn't lose people. 1/4. We asked. Did we lose people?
Good. If you all could please all get your tea, coffee, snacks, and come back. This is.
Can you please take your seats? Can you please take your seats? Thank you so much. Where is Priya? Thank you so much for staying with us, both here in the room and virtually. I'm very excited to introduce the second panel that continues on the discussion we have started a little bit more from a more applied perspective. Subhasri mentioned in her presentation that when we talk about human rights, we talk about specific human rights and specific human rights principles such as accountability, non-discrimination, participation. We talk about consent, and we also linking it back to the right to autonomy, right to self-determination, to the right to health. So we thought it might be a good idea to use one human rights principles of accountability that is also intersectional with many other human rights principles and is strongly linked with the respect, protection, and fulfillment of the right to life, right to non-discrimination, right to the right to health, the right to information. So explore the principle, the human rights principle, and just to say, it's not only a human rights principle, it's also a public health principles. It's interconnected. We shouldn't separate. So the health and human rights principle of accountability, and see how it looks like in theory and action. So I'm handing over the chairing to Sapna and to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, and welcome back, everyone. Is my mic working? Yeah. I'm Sapna Desai. I've worked with the journal for several years, and most recently I'm on the board and was guest editor of the South Asia issue. I am really excited to be here with the three of you and the three of our virtual panelists we have today. Fortunately, we need no introduction to the issue because the last panel almost naturally brought us into the questions of accountability and SRHR. So what we'll do in this panel is listen to the three of the panelists to my left here first around different aspects of accountability in practice, both in the practice of research, in creating evidence, as well as in advocacy and bringing that work to both policy and to communities. I'm going to start with Sana Contractor. Hi, Sana. I hope your bio's up. Yes. So as part of the South Asia sort of regional work we did with SRHM in the past couple of years, Sana had led a review of SRHR research that engages with different questions of accountability from different perspectives. So I think, Sana, of all people, you have the bird's eye view of what's been done in the field. And what I'd like you to start with is what you've learned and sort of reflect on how different types of evidence have been created around accountability and how they've been used both towards action and also reflections on what's missing.
Good afternoon. Right. So accountability came up in the last panel quite strongly. I want to take a step back a little bit because I think there is accountability in the research process, but seeking accountability is also a very integral part of doing a SRHR work. And that is the work that a lot of us in the room do, for example. To be clear, accountability is one of the core principles of a rights-based approach. And part of the reason is that we recognize that although a lot of sexual and reproductive rights are enshrined in human rights treaties and documents and such and are ratified by states, there are a host of barriers, legal, political, social, economic, cultural, that come in the way of their realization. And therefore, as important as it is to push governments, for governments to implement and ensure respect, protect, fulfill of these rights, it is as important for us to hold governments and non-state actors to account for what they are supposed to do, or in some cases, supposed to refrain from. So a lot of the work that we do is therefore
trying to push states to act on these principles that they've agreed upon. And so within this broader theme of rights-based evidence creation, one of the things that we thought would be useful to do would be to understand how have accountability efforts, how has the workings of accountability practice been studied? How have we researched it? How have we built evidence around it? And so we undertook a review of published literature, but also consultations with experts and grassroots activists who've been involved in active accountability seeking practice. While accountability is a very integral part of rights-based research, it's also important to acknowledge that there are different understandings of accountability in the field of public health per se. And one which has been gaining a lot of traction has been looking at accountability as an integral part of governance, which is great, but the sort of philosophical underpinnings of it are very different from what we see as rights-based accountability. So for instance, there is the understanding that citizen oversight or say performance monitoring targets will influence how actors act and will therefore increase efficiency or will increase reach or will increase effectiveness of a certain service. And so we've been seeing a lot of scientific literature emerging which says use this tool, use this scorecard, use this social audit, for example, and you will get these kind of results which they are calling accountability results. And the outcomes tend to be very health outcomes, so neonatal mortality or access to services and such. But at the same time, there's also been a growing criticism of this approach of doing accountability, which is to say that accountability practice in real life is often a very messy, complicated process. It evolves at different stages. It has a certain history. It involves transformation of power relationships between different actors. And it is not enough to only look at health system indicators to evaluate or to understand what is happening in accountability practice per se. And in order to uncover the workings of accountability, which is meaningful, we also have to find suitable research methodologies in order to be able to do this, which will require us to move beyond experimental and quasi-experimental designs to really understand the mechanisms of what is happening when we say we are seeking accountability. So when we did this review, we found a host of thoughtful research that has been done, which is interdisciplinary and which tries to capture how people have sought accountability, what has worked and how or why not. I don't want to get into all of what we found, but I think in light of the last panel discussion and also what we've been speaking about for the last 1.5 days, I want to focus a little bit about what more do we need to see in this kind of details and what more of which kind of methodologies we should be trying to focus on. The first, I think, is the absolute criticality of practitioner-centered and driven research, which came up in this question of accountability as well, that who are we doing research for and who is doing the research itself. And in that, I don't just mean who is going to be involved in validating tools or in who we are going to disseminate the information to, but it is a fundamentally epistemological question of what is seen as evidence and knowledge per se. What do communities who are affected by a certain issue understand by accountability, and how do they see it playing out when they are conducting their protests and campaigns, etc. It is also a question of how data is going to be used, which is another question of accountability, which came up in the last panel, which is that, fine, we are going to collect all this information, but then is it just going to go into an article? Or if it is practitioner driven and practitioner centered research, then there is an actual real life immediate application of the information that you actually find. Either it is used immediately to influence a health system or the state, or it also translates and is a part of the iterative process of how accountability practitioners plan their next strategies and their next steps. So participatory action research, for example, is one of the methodologies that we found being used, which I think really fits the bill to address some of these questions of accountability also. The second, I think, which was very important, which I thought was useful, was to really be curious about what mechanisms and what social mechanisms are at play when we introduce accountability efforts. And there are increasingly methodologies like the realist approach, for example, which really tries to delve into not just the fact that while you are doing your own intervention, while you are doing your own accountability effort, there are a host of other things that are happening in your context, which have to be taken into account. And in fact, the intervention that you implement is not really the mechanism that is going to bring about change, but it will interact with the context and create certain outcomes which you may or may not have thought about. And you have to be open to the fact that our interventions don't necessarily produce outcomes that we had already imagined. And I think Priya will talk more about that in her presentation as well. And so qualitative methods like the ethnographic methods that she used really help you to uncover what those mechanisms are. The third and last thing that I think is extremely critical is understanding history and keeping that in mind when studying these efforts. And that's because accountability struggles are rarely short term. So we may be writing projects or doing research projects that say, okay, we will do this legal intervention, or we will do this sort of community-based monitoring or maternal death audits over a period of 3 to 5 years. But the changes that take place or don't take place have a lot of root in the history of that particular issue in that particular place. So implementing an abortion litigation, for example, in Nepal, has a history of 20, 30 years of activism around abortion rights. And that has to come into the analysis of how we understand what works for accountability. I think for me, all of these three things were really important, because as a public health trained researcher, one tends to view accountability as an intervention like you would view a pill or a vaccine or any kind of health program. But what takes place when you introduce the intervention is so much more complicated and actually quite beautiful, whether it leads to the kind of outcome you thought it would lead to or it does not. Finally, I want to talk about why this is important for accountability in the research process per se. And I'll just say 2 sentences on it because I know my time is up. But I think the way we think about methodologies has to take into account these questions very, very seriously, not just in the context of decolonization between the North and the South, but it's actually calling for a deconstruction of elitism within the research process. And why do we think a researcher who comes from outside is better placed to understand an accountability practice than a practitioner who is actually embedded in it? And so that also says a lot about the need for co-creation of research processes and really bringing together strengths of researchers and practitioners going forward. I'll stop there for now.
Excellent, Sana. Thank you, I think, for those important principles, reminders, guidelines. I know there will be a sort of primer or a piece based on the work she had led coming out soon, so we will certainly share it with everyone here. I'm now going to turn to Priya Das. So Priya, I mean, in a way, you're going to speak a lot about an example of many of the things people have spoken about conceptually as well today. And as an anthropologist, as I'm sure many of you know Priya's work, she's been recently leading embedded work in the health system around gender rights and accountability in the health system, specifically in the area of maternal health and with nurses. So Priya, in addition to talking about sort of accountability in your work, what we wanted to hear from you is also accountability in the design of your work, the implementation and its dissemination, what it took beyond the normal research process, and also what your challenges were.
Thank you. So I think Sana's give me a really good segue to talk about what I'm going to talk about, which is looking at the mechanisms of accountability are really complex when you start looking at the whole point of accountability in governance and in system, right? A lot of what we've heard so far has been community oriented, but the work that I did was really focused on the health system. And very fortunate to have been able to do a lead this ethnographic work of into community health centers in one of the eastern states in India. And what we actually went in there not trying to do accountability. We just went in there to understand why so much of inputs into mentoring of nurses didn't really lead to what they were supposed to lead. And what we came back with understanding is this whole issue around accountability and gender inequities and the whole power dynamics that work within that. And one of the phenomena that we've sort of since talked about is the whole point of performing out. When you have target-oriented performance management, which is decontextualized, which is unrealistic because you're working in a highly resource-constrained context, what it then leads to is essentially what we are calling performing out, where a whole lot of misrepresentation, fabrication, etc., of processes to make a system look like it is performing. So a false impression of a functioning system, when in reality it is not functioning, right? So, and that is what we are calling performing out. And we know many of you are familiar with the processes of, the rosters you see in a CHC is very different to the roster on which they operate, the labor room records, the case sheets, all of those things, right? And I'm not going to elaborate on that. But the important point here is because we took an anthropological perspective to understanding performing out, it is not about who are we holding accountable within the system. The system is not a monolith, right? It is a very highly hierarchical, power structured system. So am I going to hold the nurse accountable? Am I going to hold the manager accountable? Am I going to hold the system goals accountable? Or am I going to hold the global health agenda, and the sort of national political compulsions to meet certain targets that will then be driven down to state, and then the state will drive it down further to facilities because they have to be seen to be performing. It has financial incentives attached to it, right? So it really complicated the whole process of accountability. And what was really interesting, quickly sort of saying, was it generated new loci of power within the health system, which had nothing to do with clinical services. So the data operators became the new power brokers in the system, because the only way the system survived was by manipulating data, and they had the best grasp on how to do that, right? So here is a new center of power which has nothing to do with the system performance per se. And the opposite of it was the gender inequities that were being faced by the ANMs and nurses further deteriorated, because the whole accountability burden really fell on them, because they have no power, they have no reverse accountability. So the fabrication at that level was doubly multiplied, right? And there's a beautiful term which I always loved saying, which I learned from the literature, that they were burdened with what is called the multiple accountability sort of load, and the short for that was MAD. So there was accountability was MAD at that level, right? So you further entrenching those kinds of gender inequities. So that's the piece on the research part of it. I also want to complicate the whole process of the researcher's accountability in a hierarchical system where you have different power players and you are embedded in the system, right? How do you maintain that accountability in the research process? Of course, that goes without saying, we got all the IRB done, the ethical approval, but that doesn't cut it in real time, right? Because we are dealing with there's an asymmetry of power between us and who we are calling a respondent. And the whole center where we are embedded is like pervasive with differential power relations, right? And I think somebody else in the process talked about, how we have dummy questions, right? I mean, we had different sets of strategies with the different types of people we were interacting. There was different for the medical officers, different for the nurses and AMs, different for the managerial and the accountant cadres. And I think most importantly, what we put into practice, and we understand the whole asymmetry of consent. On paper, we get consent from everybody, but what is the real agency of the person who's giving the consent, right? And we did DODs, and yeah, so we did DODs, and we had the permission. We were told you take the consent of the woman. If she's okay, you can see. But we looked at the women who were coming. They didn't even have the agency to talk to their own family. Right? So what we really try to adopt is what we call the situational ethics, right? Which is what I think Avni spoke of a little bit, which is about compassion, which is about empathy, not just with the women who were coming for the services, but also the nurses, right? Like we knew, I mean, they would get insulted in front of us. How do you deal with that? They don't want to talk to you on certain issues. How do you deal with that, right? So the MPs really sort of centered situational ethics, ethics in practice, irrespective of what the IRB said, because not everything that the IRB said is contextual and applicable. And so that whole, the day-to-day ethics was very important. And I come to my last point because I think I have a minute left, which is this whole bit about consent, about research, what do you do with the research output and the whole accountability around it. And for us, it presented a great dilemma, to be honest. We did what we had to do. We put the outputs out. We spoke as candidly about the situation to the donors, to the government, without mincing much word. But of course, you have to mince a little bit when you're presenting to the powers to be, right? Powers everywhere. It's in that dynamics, in that process of us engaging. But we were very keen to put out a few articles. And the dilemma was to keep it anonymized. Right? Because there were sensitivities of, because there was the state allowed us to do that kind of got the kind of funding if we were going to do the kind of, open writing. So I think the dilemma for us was accountability in your research output is also many times influenced by where you are located and what is the context and where you as a person are. And coming from a really management consultancy firm, which works with we talked about it yesterday, with very strong boundaries, putting that research out, even though anonymized, acknowledging that it compromises transparency and accountability. The choice we had is not to publish at all, or publish with anonymity, because for us, it was really important to capture those things that we did. We don't see much of that in the literature, the bit we did on power and nurses, on performing out, to be out there. So it's not I think accountability in research, personally, and in a system is not straightforward. I think it's a constant process of navigating and deciding for the greater good, and compromising in the process. It is a very complex sort of process all along. So, and that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya, and also for your frankness. And one of the articles from the research is in the South Asia issue that we just published, I think about last month. Now I'm going to turn to Nidhi Goyal next to me. Now, Nidhi, you've been at the forefront of activism around inclusion and disability and sexual and reproductive health and other issues. And you've used evidence and you've used advocacy at a number of levels. Can you tell us a little bit about your reflections on the use of evidence? I mean, you generate evidence, you also use different types of evidence towards action and really where those gaps are. And you've spoken very eloquently about where these gaps are. And we'd like to hear them specifically around SRHR in your experience.
Am I audible? Yeah, the second, yeah. Okay, am I audible now? Yes. Thank you so much, Sapna, and thank you both for bringing out so many complexities, and I was actually nodding rigorously when both of you were speaking because there's so much resonance and connections in what the first panel was, our colleagues here were talking about, and bringing the whole accountability piece in. I'd just like to begin by quoting you saying power is everywhere. And I really like that, because when we want to think about the human rights framework of accountability, we're looking at meaningful participation, we're looking at inclusion, we're looking at representation for someone like me, standing at multiple intersections, and working with communities who are standing at intersections specifically of gender and disability. So thinking about research, thinking about evidence-based research and advocacy and the connections, a couple of points come up, and I'll specifically take the COVID research that Rising Flame, my organization, has published around women with disabilities and their experiences within COVID-19 in India. But before I take that as an example, the understanding is that these findings and these connections between research and advocacy, or what research can look like and how it can impact advocacy, is really not a conversation, as we know, just for researchers, organizations undertaking research, or research organizations, civil society organizations. It's also for funders and philanthropists who are supporting this kind of research, and building an understanding around the gaps and the linkages are extremely important there. Power in research is where I'd like to begin, and just through a couple of examples, and really through a storytelling piece here. When COVID-19 hit India and there was a lockdown, it was very evident when key announcements were done that there was no sign language interpretation. Besides that, many of the information put up on government websites were in inaccessible formats. When we went with all of this to the government, they said, no, but we've come up with guidelines for disabled people and it'll all happen. And we said, how would it happen, sir? Here are two concrete examples of it has not been happening. And it needs to be, all our COVID response needs to be inclusive and disability sensitive. And the idea was, do you have anything to support this, right? In groups that are really marginalized, invisible, whose narratives are not out there enough, where there are not established issues. Today, I say violence against women, there's a lot to be done, but there is a lot that has been done. So there is something to fall back on. There's some comfort and discomfort both with the issue. But when you talk about women with disabilities, it's a group saying, oh, some of you exist. And so how that power from the activist or advocate is taken back and said, if you don't have this piece of research, if there's no evidence that you can produce, there is no question or discussion or change that you can bring. And I think that's really important for us in terms of what is accountability within our activism. And not just what's accountability within research, to even bring, how do we as activists have to, how do we consider or want to bring this activism and research together, or have those connections while we're taking work forward. I think the second thing, which many of my colleagues have really emphasized, is peer networks, peer researchers, community participation. I think it's extremely, extremely important within communities like ours, with really to put out there a very strong statement that when you have, there's a stark difference when you have non-disabled researchers leading disability research and when you have disabled researchers leading disability research. And that's why just the publishing of that research where two women with disabilities led this kind of understanding of a cross-country impact on women with disabilities in a disaster situation gained a lot of traction globally. There was resonance by women with disability groups from US, from UK, from not just global South countries, but many developed countries, to say, yes, this is what we experience, and this is not what is captured in many of the quick surveys and many of the other published reports, which have not been led by disabled people. There are these power structures that are in play where we talk about patriarchy. There's also ableism, and it's really simple spaces. When we're talking about or producing this evidence to the state, you tend to use the official state language or terminology for disability. In India, if you do this, it's called, people with disabilities are called Divyang, which are divine bodies, which actually, if you go to the disabled community, it's almost, it's a very disgusting word for them. Right? It's a rejected word by them. And so what happens within these spaces when we as part of society carry some of the language, some of the ableism, some of the power structures within us. And I know as researchers, challenging our bias is one thing, but really deep-seated sort of lack of engagement with the community and then diving deep or having a very top-down approach without participatory research may not work in many spaces. Also that when we do this, when we have community researchers, when we have peers from the community working with us, or our researchers who are working with us, or activists who are working with us, the understanding that needs to build again, or things that we need to challenge in terms of accountability, is accessibility. Are our research methodologies, or even something as basic as the softwares that we use for analysis of large data, have we ever thought about how our organizations procure them or engage with them, and are they accessible to people across disabilities or disabled researchers? And so really important questions around that. When we think about, again, what engagement with people with disabilities would mean, is not just, accessibility, it's about time and pace as well of the research, but also some ethical questions, which my colleagues brought up here, around how we collecting this data, where women with disabilities are, and I'll share some of the examples, 2 quick examples from the COVID report. Women with who were deaf and hard of hearing women wanted to report about the violence that they faced, right? The report really spanned accessibility, access to food and essentials, access to health, information, emotional well-being, domestic violence, health, of course, including SRH. And there was a linkage drawn with all of this. So when we've been talking about contextualizing SRH, that was something that we did in the research. But when they wanted to report, it was very difficult, because they wanted to have calls at night in the dark, because they were living with families and they were signing their response, right? So these kinds of challenges and ethical conundrums around consent. We have very simple practices of informed consent, but do we dive deeper when we want to talk to women with intellectual disabilities, or survivors with intellectual disabilities, or really sensitive SRH data of women with intellectual disabilities? Just running through formats of dissemination, and all of these for me fall under accountability. Who are we producing this data about, and who will access it? Who do we imagine will access this, right? So how many researchers think about easy to read versions, or even shorter videos, shorter multimedias, posters to disseminate some of this information to our grassroots and rural, even participants or respondents? Just to give you an example, we feel like this is a very sort of, breaking down for civil society or for larger communities, but National Commission for Women, for example, we brought them this big report. We brought them an abridged version, an easy to read version, and a multimedia piece. And they absolutely took the multimedia piece and said, this is important. This is what we'll put on our website, right? So just to see that impact, of traditional research publishing, and what are the formats that we really want to consider or fall under accountability. And the last piece is this impact and the circuit, right? We took this report, we presented it to the National Human Rights Commission, and there was another advisory issued. And we took that back to the ground. But again, the circuit of supporting women with disabilities at the grassroots to access this stopped, because their local authorities again said, this is a national report. What are the specific challenges within this locality, and how do you bring that forward? So how do we bring research to communities? How do we work with communities to produce evidence and to complete this circuit, is a very important part of accountability, particularly with groups standing at intersections. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidhi, for those words. And also, I think the reminder that all 3 of you gave us, that accountability, as Sana said, is too often reduced to this idea of a singular intervention, as opposed to an approach that needs to be embedded in the way in which evidence is generated, the way it's conducted, as well as how it's, most importantly, how it's used and with whom. At that, I'm going to turn to Esther to hear from our discussants. And thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Fascinating discussion. Thank you for all the panelists. So I'm turning to Esther. Esther, are you here? Can you come up? Yes, thank you so much. Esther, you are with us from Mexico since 5 o'clock. Thank you so much in the morning. Thank you so much for being with us and for your patience to come and discuss with us. Eszter Corona is a lead activist and expert on promoting sexuality education globally and locally. Esther, for decades, we were working hard to create evidence, public health evidence, that helps hold accountable international organizations such as UNESCO, WHO, putting out comprehensive sexuality education guidelines, and then in turn holding governments accountable to introduce comprehensive sexuality education in countries. We managed to do that. You were one of the main activist experts participating in this development over the past 2 decades. But the political scenario is changing. Now, instead of evidence-based politics and policies, governments are going on and based on ideology, disregarding the evidence that is out there on health, positive health impact of sexuality education on sexual and reproductive health, they are withdrawing sexuality education. So can you tell us a little bit about the dynamics of accountability, evidence, and politics?
Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you very much also for the invitation. And I must say that I have learned so much through the previous panel, and now the speakers have been just fantastic. And I have been, you know, they have given me a lot of thought about the kind of work I do and how accountability is precisely integrated in the research that is needed in comprehensive sexuality education, which from now on I'm going to shorten to CSE, which by definition, consensus, it's a scientifically grounded, human rights-based, gender-focused process with a positive approach to sexuality that aims for empowerment, agency, responsibility, and general well-being, particularly of children, young people, but really across the lifespan. Having said that, it is, I mean, the kind of research that we have been having over the years and the kind of evidence that has been produced has mostly been linked to health outcomes such as delayed initiation of sexual intercourse or reduced risk of STIs, HIV particularly, increased use of condoms, contraception, etc. But there is something in this kind of research which has been hardly touched upon. That is mainly because it's very difficult, because we're working in a field, education is a multidisciplinary field, as all public health, what has been mentioned before, but education particularly is something that has all kinds of inputs, and outputs are very difficult to measure in terms of the inputs, and of course to say that a certain intervention has caused certain outcomes, it's almost impossible to do. And also because education, as a matter of fact, all over the world is politically charged. And political systems come and go, regimes, administrations come and go, and educational policies change, particularly in this field of CSE. And this is something which from the last panel I got, and this idea or this fact that what we sometimes what we think that we have gained and that what is there, it can be lost very easily. Sometimes I say that for me, in my experience over 50 years in all over the world, CSC is very much a process like dancing tango. 3 steps backward, 2 steps forward. And this is what it's like. I mean, I'm sure that whatever we gain is never ultimately and completely lost. But even so, we have really to work in producing in CSC the kind of evidence that we need, and not only in these health outcomes, which are very important. I mean, yes, we need to show that CSC reduces adolescent pregnancy, for instance, or child marriage or whatever. But there are areas in which it's very important. I mean, how do we ensure that CSC creates agency, that it builds responsibility on young people, that it gives them the power to, as some researchers have said, say yes or no to sexual activity. What does consent mean, and in what kind of context? And of course, it has to be very contextualized. We cannot have enormous bodies of knowledge which cover all over the world. We really have to understand how this plays in national settings, in regional settings, and sometimes in community settings and in families. And this was brought about in a very dramatic way through the COVID pandemic, and through all the countries that had to go confinement, where we saw, particularly with young people, young girls, an increase in violence and in intra-family violence, gender-based violence. And this is something which is like, not that it was not happening before, but the lens is in this is accountability was put there precisely to show that sometimes we were forcing through these politics for young women, girls, to live with their own aggressors, their own perpetrators of violence. So,
Esther, can you sum up? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is just to conclude. So it is very important to create and to build on a different kind of research that takes in account all these factors.
Thank you so much, Esther. Thank you very, very much for your input. Thank you. So I'm calling in Sara. Sara, are you here? Thank you so much for being here. So compared to Esther in Mexico, 5 a.m., you are close to 11 p.m. in Australia. Thank you so much for patiently being with us. Hi.
It's my pleasure.
So Zahra is an activist, researcher, and socio-legal scholar working at the intersection of sexuality, technology, and the law. Zahra, can you please share a couple of thoughts about your work in the context of accountability and research, with special attention to enhancing participatory research, in particular in relation to work you are doing on sex work stigma in Australia with your colleagues and partners?
Yes, of course. And first, let me say thank you so much for having me here. It's been such a privilege to hear all of the other speakers and the incredible perspectives and experiences and approaches across the world. I'm here on the land of the Yugara and the Turrbal people. It's unceded, stolen land. And I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and emerging. I wanted to talk today a little bit about a project that we've been doing in Australia. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Queensland University of Technology. I'm also a sex worker and a lawyer, and I want to speak about sexual rights through the kind of guise of this project we did about sex work stigma in Australia. It was a partnership approach between Scarlet Alliance, which is the National Sex Workers Association, and the Centre for Social Research and Health, which is at the University of New South Wales. And like many of the speakers have spoken about today, the rights-based approach was really about involving sex workers in every single part of the process, from the conception to the design to the methods to the data collection, the analysis, and the write-up. And our approach was really founded on the fact that much of the existing research about sex work was often quite methodologically skewed. There was some presumptions about lack of agency, or it took a very pathological approach, often seeing sex work as kind of injury or through lenses of victimhood. And the research was used to fuel a rescue industry or exit programs. And so as a result, many sex workers in Australia, but also around the world, experience a real distrust in research and feel very much exploited by research. And so we wanted to do a socially applied project that kind of flipped the script, focusing on how stigma presents at meso, macro and micro levels show that the stigma is not inherent to sex work itself, but it relates to structural power and regimes of criminalization. And we wanted to emphasize the strength and resilience and agency of sex workers and their right to, our right to self-determination. So it was really about sex worker knowledge creation and reframing a lot of those words that we hear in research, like vulnerable communities. We always use vulnerable to, like vulnerable to violence or vulnerable to stigma, that places and shifts the emphasis back on the structural regimes. So we had a partnership approach right from the beginning. Scarlet Alliance did a training session with the Centre for Social Research and Health, all about like a sex worker sensitivity training for their staff, which was really well received. We had sex worker researchers involved throughout the project. It was based on previous research that had been conducted by Scarlet Alliance and the Australian Federation of AIDS organisations, which had found that sex work stigma was rife, but that research was about 20 years old. So we wanted to update it. So what we did was we held a big a national forum that's held every year annually by Scarlet Alliance. We had 100 sex workers from all over the country, and we had a big brainstorming session where we mapped out like what are the new areas of stigma and discrimination that we should be looking at. And people raised a range of issues from employment to education, healthcare, social services, financial services in particular, police and access to justice. And so this workshop then really went on to frame our focus group discussion questions. So we had peer data collectors. We did all of the recruitment through each state and territory-based sex worker organisation, and that helped ensure that we had a representative sample of sex workers with different ages, genders, racial backgrounds, different types of sex work. And also obviously having a peer-based approach invited a lot more kind of candor and trust in the interviews and the focus groups themselves. All of the coding was done with Scarlet Alliance, as well as the analysis and the writing up. And a really important part at the end was that we made sure that once we had published journal articles, that we also provided summaries that were just like 2 pages and easy to read, that we could have on the Scarlet Alliance website that summarized the research. We also presented it in oral presentations at the National Forum in subsequent years as well, so that it was able to kind of be passed back, that knowledge could be passed back into communities. So we really wanted to make sure that sex workers weren't just like glorified data collectors or just simply on an advisory panel of non-sex worker researchers. We wanted to ensure that it was meaningful involvement, also had a kind of capacity building lens to it. And we published 2 articles from that project so far. The first one was called Rethinking the Relationship Between Sex Work and Mental Health and Stigma, and it was in the Journal of Social Science and Medicine, and I will put the link in there shortly. And we had another one on sex work, horse stigma and the criminal justice system, which was all about policing, and we published that in the Journal of Crime, Justice and Social Democracy. So our rights-based approach was really, it was based on rights, but it was also based on a whole lot of other literature around insider research and peer-based research, and the value of that, kind of rejecting those colonial voyeuristic approaches to research. We had a very clear positionality as inside the community, from the community. We wanted to value the insights and the lived experiences of our peers, and kind of contest some of those notions of the field, because the field was really much our lives, and also ideas of like who are hard to reach populations, because for us, we weren't hard to reach because it was within the community. And so we wanted to make sure that the partnership approach was very much sex worker led from the beginning. And that also meant thinking a lot about privacy and consent. We had to make sure we mitigated risks of self-incrimination for people who were working across different legal regimes. We audio recorded all of the consent, so we didn't have to collect paperwork with people's signatures on it. We deleted the audio recordings, and we only kept the de-identified transcripts that were approved. and we use pseudonyms instead of legal names. So this was all in the spirit also of participatory action research. We wanted to research that could actually be useful for law reform, that would strengthen sex worker rights, not just for kind of the individual researcher's own curiosity or their CV. We wanted it to have actual community benefit and impact, and to be useful for the social movement itself. And part of that process was thinking about how the research might be used in future. So we didn't want the research to put people at further risk. Just because, for example, we might find that there was low compliance with the law, that doesn't mean that we need more police of sex work. So we needed to build those kind of caveats into the writing process to make sure that it couldn't then be used by anti-sex work advocates to push for criminalization, or it couldn't be co-opted to call for abolition of sex work. So in that sense, the right-based approach really extended all the way up to the writing up as well. And
can you sum up? Sorry. Thank you.
Can I just say one last thing to conclude? Is that the research has now been cited as part of various submissions for law reform. We've just had decriminalisation of sex work in Victoria, and we have a big push for decrim in Queensland, and it's being used very actively as part of that process. And it's been also used in training programs for psychologists and social workers to develop more sex worker friendly skills. So it's been very useful. So that's an example of how we kind of put a right-based approach into practice.
Sara, thank you so much. It's really absolutely fantastic work. And thank you so much for sharing with us, and really, really congratulations for the amazing work you are doing. Thank you very much. So I keep talking to the screen. I'm sorry, I need to talk to the camera. So then our last discussant in Taqbir. Taqbir, are you? Hi, Taqbir. Thank you so much for being here with us from Bangladesh.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Taqbir is an advocacy lead for gender justice and diversity program at Brak University, Bangladesh. So, Taqbir, you have been one of the mentee, and we are so proud that you were part of the program, and including and despite and everything that you are an experienced legal researcher, and you are carrying out a lot of work, and you applied for the program because you thought that you want to enhance your thinking and want to be part of a dialogue space when you can share your ideas and improve your own research and knowledge generation and sharing in relation to the work that you are doing as a legal researcher. Can you tell us more about your work, and also how the mentoring program you were part of is actually contributed to your thinking or not? Or how do you think about the work you are doing being part of this mentoring program?
Right. Thank you so much, Esther, and hello to everyone. So sorry I couldn't be there physically. Just a small note of correction. I'm actually with BRAC, the NGO, not BRAC University. So I'm with the Gender Justice Program at BRAC, the NGO. Previously, I was at Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust, BLAST. You already heard from Sara Hossain, who leads the organization there. So I think what I would like to, for the past, between 2020 to 2021, I was fortunate to be part of SRHM's mentorship program, where I looked at the way at which the use of medical evidence to deny justice for rape survivors. And what I mean by that is insufficient medical evidence is the single most common reason why a rape case is unsuccessful in Bangladesh and many other parts of the world. So oftentimes when rape complainants come or rape survivors seek justice in courts, one of the most common reasons why they will be unsuccessful in receiving justice is because judges will tell them that you have failed to produce sufficient medical evidence that supports your case. So that is why I chose to focus on this topic, because what happens in Bangladesh and other countries with this culture of patriarchy is that the way that the medical evidence, knowledge surrounding medical evidence for rape has been created and preserved, actually normalizes certain forms of...
We lost Taqbir. Taqbir.
Hi, sorry.
We lost your voice. We lost hearing you. Can you check your microphone? We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe it's our speaker.
I think someone in the chat box wrote...
It's the audio. The virtual participants can hear you, so maybe we can read from your mouth as you are talking, because we cannot hear you. Taqbir, just go on. The other more than 50 participants can hear you, and maybe if you can just continue. We are so sorry about that.
Okay, so I will continue. So as I was saying, that the way that medical evidence has been created in Bangladesh actually preserves certain form of sexist presumptions. So rape complainants are, they have to show that they resisted. There should be signs of resistance on their bodies to show that they did all they could to prevent or resist that rape. So these really damaging perceptions and damaging presumptions that are normalized and legitimized in the name of scientific knowledge. So what I try to do is challenge these, presumptions as not being based on scientific wisdom, but rather on sexism, and basically then create, challenge this sexist knowledge creation that had taken place over decades and decades. So in doing so, I just wanted to highlight two methodological challenges that I faced. The first is the lack of official data. So in developing countries, you will understand that official data is not as readily accessible as it might be in certain developed nations. So what that allows is that if you don't have official data, you don't have official data that you can use to form your critique. And if you don't have that, then government officials can always enjoy a level of plausible deniability. So they may just say that your critique is not acceptable because your critique is not based on official data. Now, but it's in the hands of the government officials to produce the official data, and if they don't produce it, then they enjoy this kind of plausible deniability that I just mentioned. So one of the ways we've tried to challenge that is using right to information applications, which allows citizens to apply for certain types of information as a matter of right, and government officials are bound to respond to those applications within a certain time period. And if they don't, then we can go to the Information Commission. So then RTI application, or right to information applications, has been one of the ways we've tried to circumvent this methodological challenge of not having official data. The second methodological challenge that we faced is, we obviously want to develop survivor-centric reform proposals, but having survivor engagement within the research participation process requires institutional review board clearance or ethical clearance, which can often be very costly in countries like Bangladesh, where IRBs are few in number, and they can charge quite hefty fees and also take a lot of time, which is not always practically feasible, particularly for those in the NGO world. Now, moving on from the methodological challenges, I just wanted to highlight some of the opportunities.
Taqbir, 1 minute, please. Taqbir, 1 minute, it's okay? Thank you.
Yeah. So the first opportunity, as I said, is I think we really need to use desk review to identify the existing sources of sexist knowledge creations, and then use those to challenge it and then uproot it. So the way we've been doing it is by analyzing Supreme Court judgments and articles in medical college journals, which are rather readily accessible as opposed to official statistics. So using these sources, identifying the sexist myth-making and then challenging them using rights-based discourse. The second opportunity is to use the generated evidence for collective advocacy. So we've gotten 17 organizations, including BRAC and BLAST, have got together to form Rape Law Reform Coalition, and we conduct human rights advocacy using the evidence with progressive MPs. And finally, I just wanted to say the other third option is public interest litigation, which Sara Hossain had already spoken about. So we use the evidence that we've generated in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh as well for strategic litigation cases. So I just wanted to end my presentation here. Thank you.
Taqbir, thank you so much. And really sorry about the technical glitch. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing. And Taqbir's article is forthcoming based on the work he's doing and also based on the mentoring program participation as well in SRHM. We are looking forward to read it. Taqbir, thank you so much.
I first of all like to thank all of our amazing panelists. I think we're all leaving very inspired, but I think equally challenged by how we must do better when it comes to thinking about accountability in all spheres of our work. I'm in that really unfortunate chair position where I'm not allowed to take questions, unfortunately, due to time. And I think there were several questions on accountability last time. So I can only suggest that we take some of our questions outside, while I apologize to the virtual panelists about not being able to take questions. But as we all know, this is a long movement and a long journey. So this is certainly not the last opportunity we have to meet like this. But thank you again to all of you. And this was really a fantastic and
thank you for all the participants. Thank you for the panelists, for the discussants, getting up so early and staying up so late. And thank you for all colleagues, the chairs. Thank you for Gates Foundation for supporting the event. And we wish you a beautiful evening, rest of the day, and good night. Bye-bye.